Hi guys, welcome to another episode of Around the Emirates with Sarah, where I speak to experts from across the UAE about topics you want to hear about. Today, I'm joined by special guest Paula. Hello, Paula.
Hello, Sarah.
Paula is CEO of Predixa, which sounds like a really cool company name, but the explanation is something that I don't want to mess up, so I'm going to let Paula explain what it's all about.
Okay, well, lovely to see you, Sarah, and thank you so much for inviting me onto this podcast. So yes, in terms of Predixa, what it does, it is essentially a diagnostic tool that's driven by the power of artificial intelligence to help organizations find out much more quickly and more efficiently, and therefore at lot less cost, where the key areas of focus they should be working on with reference to a full company transformation. So we have what we call our CTX module, and then we also have a module that focuses on the issues surrounding diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I know that obviously from your audience perspective, gender equality and the issues around DEI will probably be of very much interest to them. So we can more focus on that side of things and my experience that I draw on for that.
You're almost making my job too easy for me, Paula. So you've mentioned two really interesting things. You've mentioned artificial intelligence and you've mentioned, DEI. So Can you please share with me a little bit more about your background and how you got yourself into that space?
Well, yes, and it'll probably be quite surprising for you and your audience to realize that I'm not technical. I haven't been an engineer. I'm not a programmer, but I'll come to that in a moment. But in terms of my background, actually, I started out very much on the creative side. I trained as a textile designer.
Oh, wow.
You can see my color. Color is very important to me, and this is my favorite color. I find if I don't wear this color pink, then my day doesn't go as well. No, I trained as a textile designer, and I do passionately believe that actually the way business will flourish in the future comes from a core of creativity, particularly now, of course, with the pandemic and as we're emerging from the lockdown and the challenges, many organizations have found that they were really challenged during the pandemic, and they've had to accelerate their digital progress, and they were faced with, supply chain issues. They were faced with customers becoming ever more demanding. And they were also faced, of course, with a workforce that through lockdown had all sorts of mental problems, anxieties, and wanted these organizations to prove to them that they were valued and that they really cared about their, not just their physical well-being, but their mental well-being as well. And so we find that transforming companies is not just in the general rule of, looking at your sales and your HR and your operations and your marketing, whatever. It's also focused on the diversity, equity, and inclusion topics as well. And this is why it's so prescient right now. But the creativity side of things, I think, is really important. So I trained as a textile designer, and I fully intended to be a world famous textile designer. Unfortunately, no one had told the world. So after about 3 years, and I hadn't sold enough textile designs to realize that this was really going to be something I could do for the rest of my life, I took a change of direction and I moved into buying.
Okay.
And I worked as a buyer for two companies that are very well known in the UK called Marks and Spencer's and Next.
Oh yes.
And yes, and back then in the 90s, which gives you a little bit of an idea how old I am, that back then those two organizations were absolutely out on their own, focusing on issues surrounding ethical supply chains. So what would often happen would be that I would go to factories and suppliers and manufacturers around the world where the product was right and perhaps the price was, within the range, but I didn't approve them as suppliers because of the way that they were treating their staff, and it was clear that they didn't value them. And it was often down to safety issues or health and well-being or discriminatory issues. And this has really sort of driven me for all these years. And so I've been involved in the issues around diversity, equity and inclusion, DEI, corporate social responsibility, CSR, and environmental, social and governance, ESG, before many of these terms were invented. But this sort of has brought us into the field I mentioned with Predixa, very much on the DEI space.
Right.
Because what we all believe passionately is that, yes, there's a moral obligation in many of these issues, and particularly with things like gender equality. And if we look at the UN nations sustainable development goals, of which SDG 5 is one of the absolute underpinning ones, SDG 5 being gender equality. Yes, there is a moral obligation on some of these things, because the SDGs are all about building a world by 2030 that is balanced in terms of social side of things as well as looking after the planet. However, the fact is that, as I mentioned before, coming out of the pandemic, where so many organizations have been challenged to change much quicker than they had anticipated and to be much more adaptable, that although you may morally feel it's the right thing to do, it needs also to be grounded on what's right for business in terms of its impact on both the top and the bottom line. And I'll give you an illustration, a story that sort of shows this, that when I was consulting many years ago, we were trying to find some embroidered bed linen. And I was in Northeast China in a place called Qingdao. And the agent that I was working with told me that he'd found this fantastic factory, and he said, "You're going to love it, Paula." So we went and visited, and I did the official tour, and he was absolutely right. The product itself was outstanding. The quality was beautiful.
Right.
The workmanship was amazing. The prices were within range. But I asked also to see the workers' accommodation. And there was a little bit of hesitancy, but I insisted. And we went round, and I wasn't surprised there was hesitancy, because the cooking facilities were pretty awful. The bathroom facilities were dreadful. And when I asked how did workers get a proper shower, I was just told that it was just a 5-kilometer walk into town where they could use the shower facilities
5
at the local
kilometers?
swimming pool. 5 kilometers.
What, for a shower?
Well, they did have shower facilities in the workers' accommodation, but it was almost like a stripped down wash and a bucket and this sort of thing. It was really not acceptable at all. And then things like the recreational area for the children to play. So if you had married couples that had children, there was a little school, and their area to play was literally an open, sort of plain area of concrete, which had an open sewer running down 2 sides. Anyway, so that evening over dinner, they very excitedly sort of said, "So, Paula, what did you think?" And I said, "Well, the product, you're right, this was fantastic. The quality is brilliant. The price, I think we're not too far off." And they said, "Great, well, let's talk numbers." And I said, "Well, no, I'm not going to place any orders."
No way, of course not.
Shocked. Yeah. And I said, it's because it's clear you don't value your workforce. And I said, and it's so short-sighted of you, because if you invested a little bit in providing proper accommodation, not only would you keep your best embroiderers, you would attract the best embroiderers from your competition. This would give you competitive advantage. It would also increase your capacity, which would mean you could take on more customers, which would increase your revenues, it would increase your profits, it would increase your reputation, and you would grow and grow and grow. So until you can prove to me that you care for your workforce properly, I'm not going to place the order.
And
So
every
they
right
were,
to do so.
well, they, as you can tell, it was a little, you can imagine it was probably a bit tense as, you know, I went to bed that evening. And then the next morning, the agent grabbed me and said, Paula, we've been talking so much and we agree with what you said. We're going to do this. We're going to invest in the workers' accommodation you suggested.
Okay.
Anyway, cut a long story short, they did that. We placed the order and it pretty much went the way as I had suggested. It then became one of the sort of approved factories for the likes of much of the UK high street and America and elsewhere.
Wow.
And I tell that story on two levels. Firstly, because, you know, I love a story that has a happy ending. But secondly, it illustrates the principle that we at Predixa absolutely live by, is that it has to show the impact to the top and the bottom line. So in terms of your original question, is how did you get into this and whatever, as I said, I don't code, I don't come from an engineering background. I come from the experience of consulting, and my colleagues and I have brought that, and then we have worked with other colleagues who have actually built the artificial intelligence side of things. But we bring the content, if you will, and that's where my experience and, as you can perhaps tell, my passion comes from.
I firstly thank you for sharing that story. I think that you hit on a lot of very important points. Firstly, the fact that you are so personally involved in this, like this is a part of your character, who you are is very much embedded in this business. Like that's clear from the way that you're speaking about this. And secondly, the fact that you almost took the risk of not entering a business negotiation because of what you saw. I think that morally on its own is inspiring, because not everybody would, like, they see a number, they go after the number. So I definitely think that you are sharing a lot of lessons from the first question of the episode, which is phenomenal. My next question is, I guess this one kind of taps into the answer for the first question, but kind of what were the main obstacles that you saw in your journey, and how do you feel you have or are overcoming them as you speak?
Well, in terms of biggest challenges, those obviously were challenges, but I came from that background. You know, I'd come up through the likes of Marks and Spencer's and Next, and I knew that we'd done that before. Incidentally, funnily enough, I was just thinking, I'm just having my coffee mug here. I don't know whether you can see it, but it's got the motif of fair trade. And I'm currently sitting in my parents' home. I was explaining to you that I flew yesterday from Dubai back here home in London. And in fact, my mother has been an absolute advocate for fair trade ever since it was created, absolutely. And she, not only will you never find any coffee or bananas or anything, or oranges or anything that are not bought through the fair trade organization in this house, but wherever she is, like at the church, for instance, you know, all the coffee there is fair trade. So, you know, she sort of comes from that passion as well. And perhaps that's partly where I got it from. But in terms of real challenges, yeah, absolutely, she's been an inspiration. But in terms of some challenges, I was thinking when I was preparing for this, you know, what would be an example of a real challenge? And I suppose one of them would be, and what did I learn from it, was when I was made redundant. And I mean, being made redundant is a shock for anybody. I think the other thing to say is that it is very, very common nowadays.
Of course.
And I was also made redundant by somebody who was a great friend of mine. And I recognized how painful the process was for him to go through. But I was hugely respectful of the fact that he was able to sort of remove the personal side of things and take what he obviously believed to be was the right thing for the business. The business at the time was restructuring, and Although they did offer me another position, I didn't want to move into that particular position. But what it did was that, of course, it's really shocking, and because you're being rejected effectively. So it's a tough thing to deal with. But I remember leaving and phoning up my husband, and we met for sort of a coffee and had a chat. And the end result was that it made me realize that now I was free to actually, let's try something I'd been thinking about for some time, which was, I'd said to you that I trained as a textile designer. So I have been designing textiles and trying to sell them to the buyers of textile designs. And then when I was a buyer, we have an expression in the UK that I was poacher turned gamekeeper, you know, because then I was buying the textile designs from other designers. And so I could see the inefficiencies in the system. And this was a long time ago, before sort of computer aided designs and CAD systems and things. So back then, the way that the process that was involved was that you would, as a designer, you build up a large portfolio, and you would physically be carrying all of these paintings and things around and displaying them and showing them in its physical sense. Now, of course, that sounds so outdated and archaic because it's all on screen and it's computer aided design and everything. But back then we were still doing it manually. And so I could see that there was a real opportunity to create a trading hub, an online trading community where designers could upload their designs onto the system, and that buyers could go in and then choose and search for things like pink florals or blue checks or whatever, and be able to see whatever was available. And I remember being told, no, that will never work, Paula.
Are you
but
serious?
Of course it did. Yes, it did. So that was a real challenge to face internally. You know, I felt rejected, and I felt, oh no, how am I going to pick myself up from this? But of course, actually, what often happens is when you have a situation where you really have to take stock, sometimes it can be the real cause for moving and doing something that you hadn't thought you were going to do, because you hadn't needed to, because life just kept chugging along. Exactly. So that was a challenge, but I learned a lot from that.
Honestly, I think your challenge was twofold. I mean, it's one thing to, of course, be made redundant when you didn't really see it coming. It's another thing to be made redundant by someone that you know personally. So for you to have been able to kind of compartmentalize and be like, okay, this person is my friend, we're speaking in a professional, environment. So it's nothing against me. It's just what's best for the business. And like you said, another position was offered to you, just not one that you felt was right for you at the time. So I definitely think that in itself shows a lot of strength, and it shows that people listening to this episode can say, well, hey, just because I'm maybe made redundant doesn't mean that I don't have something bigger waiting for me at the end of this. And like you said, I mean, it reminds me of kind of, like the big geniuses like Steve Jobs or whomever, who would, have like something like the iPod or introduce like something like the internet and be like, well, that's not going to amount to anything. Well, actually, it's the future, but you just don't know it yet because you haven't seen it for yourself, how you can use this. So I think that's absolutely phenomenal.